Welcome to Truth Jihad Audio Visual. I'm Kevin Barrett, and I'm happy to be back doing an annual event that's been happening now for many years, the annual 9/11 Physics Debate on Einstein's birthday. I think we're actually on the exact birthday, March 14th this year, and we've got two physicists and an engineer here to debate the question of, are physicists or engineers better situated to argue that the official story of what happened to the buildings in New York on 9/11 is false, and that the best hypothesis about what really happened is the nuclear demolition hypothesis. Everyone here is on board with that hypothesis, including the physicists Heinz Palmer and Francois Roby, and Joe Olson, an American engineer. So I'm turning it over now to Rick Shattuck, the host of these debates. He's from Aneta.org. Rick, it's another great day for a 9/11 physics debate, isn't it?
Yes, thank you, Kevin. The Association for 9/11 Truth Awareness is on K Street in Washington, D.C., lobbying for a new investigation of 9/11. And we've been sponsoring the debate since 2014. And Dr. David Griscom, a PhD from Brown University, was the only one who responded, and we've had difficulty finding a PhD in physics who's willing to defend the official story. And then in 2016, Dr. Crockett Graby of Caltech was our debater. In 2017, Dr. Stephen Jones, PhD from Vanderbilt. And then 2018, David Chandler. And last year, Dr. Josh Middledorf, PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, debated Dr. Denise Rancourt, a professor of physics at the University of Ottawa. And this year, we have Dr. Francois Roby and Heinz Palmer, as well as professional engineer Joseph Olson. And our honorarium typically is Bitcoin. And this year, everyone's going to get the 0.000911 Bitcoin and Ethereum base hex, 911 hex points. So, take it away.
Okay, so we'll start with Heinz Palmer and Francois Roby. Heinz Palmer is well known for his nuclear demolition article at Veterans Today. So maybe Heinz, you and Francois can give us the brief overview of why the nuclear demolition hypothesis is the best explanation of what happened to these buildings, in particular the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001.
Well, I think the best is if Francois starts with his story, because he's talking mainly about energy.
Yes, I can start. So my argument is a very simple one. Actually, it's very basic physics. At the beginning, I was reading Dmitry Kalesov text. And he made a very, very thick book about 9/11, and I watched some of his videos too, and I thought it was completely crazy what he claimed, that there had been nuclear bombs, huge nukes actually, under the three buildings which went down on 9/11. I thought it was a completely crazy idea, but at the same time, I thought that there was some rather simple way to check this crazy idea, because he was giving the energy. We call that the power of the nuclear bombs, but actually it's the energy. He was talking about 150 kilotons of each bomb. And it was so huge that if such bombs had been used underground, as he said, then there was no way that the energy could not be liberated as heat. And as you know, there have been a lot of heat released at ground zero just after 9/11, and even weeks and even months after that. So I knew that we had some infrared temperature measurements after 9/11 for some, I don't know how, when was the last one? It was in February maybe of 2002. And so we could estimate the temperature in the World Trade Center zone. We could estimate the heating power of that zone, and we could estimate the characteristic time of the characteristic cooling time of this zone. And all that combined with a very simple argument. When you forget all the details, you don't need to make precise calculations. You can get an estimate of how much energy was released as heat, simply as heat, on ground zero after 9/11 attacks. So I've made the calculation, and I found that the amount of energy was huge. It was about 1 petajoule, or 10 to the power 15 joule. And when you are a physicist like me, you know that there are some limits in the quantity of energy that you can release from a chemical reaction, whatever it is, or a nuclear reaction. And these limits are completely different if they are chemical or nuclear. For a chemical reaction, any chemical reaction, it can be a combustion, it can be explosive, it can be even food. When you eat food, you have a chemical reaction inside your body. It's about 10 megajoules per kilogram. It can vary a little, of course, but the order of magnitude is 10 megajoules per kilogram. In the case of nuclear energy, it's much, much, much more. So it means that once you have an estimate of the amount of energy which is released at ground zero, if you suppose that this energy was released thanks to a chemical reaction, you have a minimal amount of mass which is needed for this heat to be released. And if you make this simple calculation, you end up with a mass of around 100,000 tons, metric tons, which is the same order of magnitude as the mass of the Twin Towers, for instance. So it's really something huge and practically impossible to realize, even if you forget the issue of placing explosives in the buildings. Only the mass itself, it's really something too huge to exist. On the other hand, if you consider nuclear explosives, you can maybe have something like 10 tons for the 3 buildings, or so it's something quite practical. So it was, of course, quite shocking for me, but I had no other explanation than to admit that there must be some nuclear source of energy deep underground, which was the main cause of the destruction of the Twin Towers and of the WTC-7. So pardon my English, I'm not really used to speak English, but here is my argument. I think Heinz can add a lot of technical details on that.
Yes, and Heinz, maybe you could also explain how we know how much energy or how much heat was released. Why do we know that there was that much heat? That needs to be explained.
Well, or maybe I can add some explanations too. I don't know if Heinz wants me to add something, or you prefer to add something yourself, Heinz?
No, that's fine. I can give my explanation right away. I have had the same problem as Francois had. The 150 kiloton mentioned by Dmitry Kalesov was utterly too high and utterly too much, in my opinion. So when I did look for an explanation, what happened to the Twin Towers, and I understood Kalesov is right because of the energy, because of the dust involved, and because of the fountain which formed. So I knew he was right in principle, but I had a problem that 150 kiloton was just extreme, simply because, well, that's 10 times the Hiroshima bomb. So I made my models with 20 kiloton and so on, just to have a nuclear engine, but nonetheless, I never got up to the 150 kiloton mentioned by Kalesov. During my first presentation in Switzerland, during my first public presentation in Switzerland, I presented a so-called black box design. So I said, we know as a physicist, we are quite sure that the process is or was nuclear, but we don't know what was in between. I felt there was something in between, a sort of filter, a sort of buffer zone, because we have two main riddles in the 9/11 truth movement, if we call about a nuclear device. The first riddle is the shock wave should have been much, much bigger. A cratering, for example. For 150 kiloton, we get a crater normally with 100 meters deep. And the second riddle is radioactivity. The radioactivity and the values must have been much, much higher in case of a 150 kiloton bomb. So this is the main argument of all these enemies, so to speak, who are against any nuclear hypothesis. And I made a bit of, well, let's call that bad science or tryouts. I made sketches of trying to figure out what could have been this filter, a sort of fusion. Suddenly, Francois digged out an old manual for nuclear landscaping, or it is called a symposium on nuclear engineering. And he pointed out that the use of a water booster can tremendously increase the explosive power of a nuclear bomb, while the charge must not be very high. So we thought for a while that a water booster was involved under the towers. However, this poses the problem that a cavity must have been created first to fill it with water and to pose the bomb inside before detonating it, so that you have basically a steam eruption. So that was the state of the art for me a few years ago, or 1 year ago. And then I was thinking about another possibility of a filter. So now it's a shame that I have no video available, but you just think of the following mechanism: that you have a slow nuclear burn, which is working for 1 hour and which is burning its way down to the granite. So you have a sort of natural reactor. I mean, a reactor which is, of course, created to run that way, to become supercritical after 1 hour. And then you have to have a small channel which allows the eruption, or which is guiding the eruption upward. So if you have a sort of explosion below, this explosion energy will try to erupt, and led by the channel will go upwards. But if the channel is narrow enough, the small channel will cool the melt down, and it will create a melt plug. So you just imagine you have an erupting nuclear explosion which wants to go through a small channel and is suddenly stopped because the channel is too narrow. So you have moving, contaminated material which is suddenly stopped. I call this the eruptive egg, which wants to erupt but cannot erupt. Because this egg has a certain speed, direction, a preferred direction, a sort of burn through can happen. That means that the atomic nuclei, which are racing around, bumping into each other, are transmitting their energy to other nuclei, which are higher up in our eruptive egg scheme. By this, the eruptive gases will have a sort of cleanup. They will be filtered through the granite, while the granite, the contaminated granite, let's say a 20-meter sphere in radius, will be down, and a few meters up, about 30,000 cubic meters of working gases can erupt, and only or mostly clean gases will shoot through the tower and tear it apart. So suddenly I ran into the problem that the 150 kiloton cannot be used in full, and I need a huge amount of working gases. And I came to the conclusion that the 150 kiloton are correct. But first, by a short process, so it was not an explosion like we are used to talk about a bomb in a microsecond, but an explosion which needs a time of about a few milliseconds. So the shock wave will be much softer. And well, the energy is transmitted by the atomic nuclei bumping into each other in pulse transfer. And so the eruption clean eruption can take part. And the rest is simply ordinary physics, fountain and erupting building, which is destroyed from top to bottom. Well, that's the short explanation, unfortunately without pictures.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and people can look at the Veterans Today article, which we will link along with this show, and they can see the full presentation with the pictures. Well, Francois, could you maybe discuss the point that I raised about the question of where do we get this very large amount of heat that needs to be explained?
Yes, actually, I made a physics paper, not a peer-reviewed one, but I let it. I published this paper on the French site HAL, which is the equivalent of archive.org in the USA. So the title of my paper is "What is Basic Physics Worth?" You will find it quite easily. And in this paper, I just used a lot of reports, technical reports, firefighters reports regarding the high temperatures that were measured at ground zero. There is a very good report made by the association. I don't remember her name. Andrea Dreger, I think, a woman who is a member or who worked for the association, the Architects and Engineers Association for 9/11 Truth. And in this report, a lot of data are shown about temperature measurements at which date. So it means basically you have, it's like when you have, for instance, a mug of tea, and you have the temperature as a function of time. You can measure the temperature. You have different points in time, and then you can estimate how much energy is released by this mug, which is gradually cooling down. just by knowing the temperature, by knowing the surface of the mug, and by knowing basic laws of heat transfer, which is very, very simple. Well, not really simple, but classical problem of physics of heat transfer. This is the kind of problem you have basically when you build a house and you have to make heaters somewhere to be comfortable, and you must know the surface of the heaters and the temperature of the water and so on. So this is a very, very well-known physics. So once you know the temperature at different time, you can simply applying this physics laws. I won't explain you all the detail today, but you can very simply have a rough estimate of the amount of heat. Actually, there are several mechanisms by which the heat is released. There is free convection, there is forced convection, there is radiation, conduction, but no need to worry about, because if you choose even one reason, as all these effects accumulate, if you just choose one, you will have a lower estimate of the amount of energy, and that was just what I wanted to have. So I chose to consider only free convection, and I got this huge amount of energy, again, just from official public data, not any hidden data from spies, or I don't have any knowledge in secret services. So it's extremely public. There was nothing special. So the only personal idea I had was just to and even I think I was not the only person to have this idea, but maybe I was the first to put it in a physics paper. Was to estimate the amount of mass which was necessary for a corresponding amount of energy. So once you have understood that for a given energy, you have a minimum amount of mass with a chemical reaction, whatever it is, and that you have a very different amount of mass for a nuclear reaction. If you calculate a mass which is huge, such as 100,000 metric tons, you must admit that there is no other solution as the nuclear option, without knowing anything about the precise technical aspects. I mean, when I make this calculation, I even don't know if it is a nuclear explosion or if it is a nuclear slow heat release, for instance. It can be anything. It's just that it is nuclear, but I don't go into the details. In my paper, I give maybe some hints, because I've read some books about using nuclear energy for non-military uses. And for instance, I've read this book, which is the constructive uses of nuclear explosives. It was published in '68, so it was one of the numerous books which were written in the '60s about the non-military uses of nuclear explosives, and it was something which was very, very common at that time. So you must understand that even though now it seems very odd to consider that some engineers might have designed something to destroy building from the very beginning, before building the building itself. It's something which was, in my opinion now, rather normal at that time. So my idea is that of course, this nuclear destruction setup was not in the first time a criminal setup. It was just for normal demolition. It was just something which was designed at the beginning in order to be able, when desired, to take down the building, and then it was used later for what we know. I don't know if I answer correctly your question, but I'll make it as simple as possible.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the public sources you used for the amount of heat? Because there's been a dispute about this. For instance, NIST responded to questions about witness reports of molten metal flowing under ground zero for months afterwards by saying, we've never heard of any such reports. And yet there are such,
Yes. So to be very clear, I do not use this. Well, I'm citing these reports in my paper, but I do not use the fact that there were, for instance, molten steel in the remnants of the World Trade Center. I'm only using the surface temperature measurements which were made airborne, or even maybe by satellite, and so it was only the surface temperature which was used in my calculations.
Very interesting. Okay, are we ready to turn it over to the engineers, represented by Joseph Olson, the American team and the engineering team, as opposed to the European physics team? So Joe, what do you have anything to add or critique in what we've heard so far?
Yes, I do. First of all, I just accidentally happened to turn on the TV that morning on 911, and the first building had already been hit, and I'm sitting there watching it, and I was going, my God. And then I watched, quote, live on TV when the second plane hit, and when I saw the one tower starting to lean over at a 22-degree angle and then straighten up and fall down, I went, absolutely could not have been done with a jet airliner. So I didn't believe it from day one. Well, when FEMA released their report along with the American Society of Civil Engineers in May 2002, I read it. I said, absolute BS. But I was involved in a divorce case and trying to avoid bankruptcy from a decade of horrible stuff. So I didn't have the time to dedicate to that. So I just kind of put 911 on a back burner. Then NIST released their report on World Trade Centers 1 and 2 in September of 2005. Their report on World Trade Center 7 in 2008. I read those reports. In May of 2009, Architects and Engineers for 911 Truth had a 2-hour DVD premiere with a 2-hour additional press conference in Austin, Texas with InfoWars. I attended that meeting. I got there an hour early. I reviewed all the material that Architects and Engineers for 911 Truth had, along with their hypothesis that it was thermite that did the damage. Since then, they had 3 DVD 2-hour premieres in Houston. I attended all 3 of those. 2 of them, Richard Gage was there. I debated him at that meeting about using nuclear weapons, and we went to dinner afterwards and discussed it, but he's absolutely adamant, and he's adamant that he's not going to debate anybody that does have valuable information on the nuclear hypothesis. Then in May of 2014, Veterans Today started publishing articles about the nuclear vaporization of the Trade Center buildings, and they included links to a whole bunch of different sources that I had not previously been in contact with. One of those is Staff Officer's Report, Nuclear Weapons Employment Doctrine and Procedures, and this was declassified. It's FM 101-31-1, and it explains the difficulty of using multiple nuclear weapons in the field because they absorb gamma rays and light off on their own. So you can't really stockpile nuclear artillery shells in the battlefield without having multiple uncontrolled nuclear reactions. Then also they linked 4th generation nuclear weapons by Andre Gosper. And so that was valuable background information on how those things actually happen. They also linked Ground Zero nuclear demolition of the World Trade Center by William Cahill. I read that. And then on March 16th, 2015, I was interviewed by Dr. James Fetzer for 2 hours on the nuclear demolition. Based on that point, by about 25 or 30 articles that were under the heading of nuclear education at Veterans Today. Then in 2016, I attended, September 11, 2016, I attended the Austin Truth Fest, where Jim Mars and Christopher Boland explained what actually happened on that day. And I got Christopher Boland's book, Solving Nuclear 911, read that. Then I attended the JFK conference in Dallas with James Fetzer, and I got a copy of his book, America Was Nuked on 911. I read that. And then in 2018, I was contacted by Robert David Steele to do a memo for the president. He said, you have to keep it under 800 words because President Trump won't read more than 1 or 2 pages of material. And so I wrote a memo to the president, which at this point had 4 million views. It's called Twin Towers Destroyed Using Clean Nukes. And then a year later, I was going to be a guest on Coast to Coast AM talking about global warming. And I decided they have interviewed Richard Gage several times in the past. And so I decided I would answer some more questions about the actual construction of the building and the demolition of the building that had not been addressed by anybody at that point. And at that point, Veterans Today had published 80 articles on nuclear education. I read all of them contemporaneously with when they were posted at Veterans Today. I wrote an article called Unequivocal 911 Nukes. And this explains the construction of the building. And it also explains that Richard Gage is a disinformation agent. 2 of the other authors, or actually 3 of the other authors that did memos to the president are disinformation agents. And I was contacted by one of my
Joe,
readers.
let me just interrupt for a second and say, I don't think it doesn't help the case to accuse people. Ad hominems actually weaken your case. So it's better to just stick with the facts.
All right. Well, then let's just say I disagree with their hypothesis. How's that? Okay. Because I don't want to step on too many toes today. So then I was contacted by one of my readers. They said, you really need to review Heinz Palmer's information at 911truth.de. So I went to their website. I started reviewing the material. I knew instantly that it was a complete reinforcement of all of the 80 articles that had been at Veterans Today. So I contacted Gordon Duff. He posted it under the heading Breathtaking, Solving Nuclear 911, the Palmer Report. Now, this report has 40 PowerPoint slides, which show in sequence the exact nuclear demolition of the building. But there's some things that they didn't include in the geometry of the building and the site conditions. So we'll get to that in just a second. So after they wrote this and it was posted, I started doing some additional review, and I went, well, Heinz did an excellent job, but he missed a couple of factors that really need to be added into the equation. So I wrote an article called Exposing the NIST Jenga Game. And this is based on the 2 reports that were done by NIST on the failure of the 3 different buildings that day. And in addition, in Heinz's report, he mentions that steel can absorb, he mentions that steel can absorb gamma rays and that it has 4 stable isotopes. So what he didn't mention is it has 24 radioactive isotopes. So I thought, well, what is the rest of the building made of? And concrete is made out of carbon, silicon, and calcium. Together with iron, you have 98 available stable and radioactive isotopes, making this a giant gamma absorber. It's sitting on granite bedrock, which has all four of those elements. In addition, it has potassium and sodium, which together add another 50 available isotopes. So now you've got a ground condition where you have the ability to absorb gamma rays with 150 isotopes. All of those isotopes are going to be radioactive. Some of them are going to be short-lived radioactivity, and they're going to give off heat for 3 or 4 months, which is exactly what we saw at the Ground Zero site. There was a 2.2 Richter scale earthquake 12 seconds prior to the initiation of collapse of both of those buildings, and the buildings were both collapsed in 14 seconds. So you had exactly the same nuclear input for each building, and you had exactly the same response as far as delayed time from the explosion to the point where you managed to get visual destruction of the building. Now, the building itself had 50 concrete lined elevator shafts and 3 concrete lined stairway shafts that went from the basement most of the way up through the core of the building. So you had a waveguide that would absorb the gamma rays with all of those materials being converted into isotopes and vaporize the core of the building. When the core of the building started to fall, then you had the bar joists, which were connected to the steel spandrel sections on the exterior of the building and to interior columns. When the interior columns fell, the whole center started falling down into the crucible. Now, on the granite bedrock, you actually burned a 150-foot hole down into the granite underneath the building. They built the bathtub of that building, the foundation, 40 feet deep on granite bedrock because New York had been covered during the last ice age with 1,000 feet of glacier. When the glaciers retreated, they dropped 40 feet of rock rubble and dirt on top of Manhattan. And the Hudson River is a fault line that runs pretty much straight up from New York. And that fault line, the water level there, sea level, is 15 feet below grade level. If you went down to 40-foot granite bedrock and you tried to blast out the granite to go deeper, then you would stand a chance of breaking that 100-foot rock, rubble, and dirt dam between you and the Hudson River, and you would have flooded all of Manhattan. So they didn't put any basement below that level. The very center of the building was the only elevator that had a continuous vertical elevator shaft, and that was elevator number 50, conveniently right in the center of the building. So if you go into the basement of the elevator building, you could put as small as a 2-kiloton bomb. The granite would work as a lens that would absorb the gamma rays and force them up through the core of the building. You blast out a few little elevator separation shafts on the way up that were used for zone elevators. And then you have a continuous tube coming up through the center of the building where you can direct all of that energy, and you will get cascading plumes of pulverized and vaporized rock showering out of the top of the building. Now, let me see if I can find my notes on that. Detonation velocity for steel, and this is the velocity when you exceed the speed of sound in a material, it decomposes. So the molecular bonds break apart at the speed of sound in the material. For steel, the detonation velocity is 6,100 meters per second. For concrete, it's 3,200 meters per second. For thermite, the maximum measured thermite energy is 895 meters per second. Steel vaporizes at 5,200 degrees Fahrenheit, but steel melts at 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. Thermite burns at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, but it takes a 3,000 degree magnesium fuse to light the thermite. And then according to their own research, in their Beyond Misinformation, they say that it takes 0.13 pounds of thermite to melt each pound of steel. Well, you did more than melt the steel, you vaporized the steel. by two methods. One was high heat and the other was detonation velocity. So you broke it apart into absolute nothing but little molecules. Now, the claim that they found thermite nanoparticles in the dust, the exterior of each building had 2,200 tons of aluminum on the exterior of the building. And when you vaporize aluminum and steel, you're going to form nanoparticles of FeAl2, which is thermite. So you're going to find thermite in the dust, and the thermite that was in the dust could not have been part of the chemical reaction to use thermite in the building. So that would have just added additional thermite to whatever thermite load it would have taken to do that massive amount of damage. In addition, the debris field for World Trade Center 1 and 2 was pretty much 2 or 3 stories above grade level. But if you take into account the amount of steel and concrete that had fallen down into the pit, then you also have that reduced amount of mass that needed to be vaporized, which reduces the size of the nuclear weapon that was involved. And I realize some of this is kind of technical. And so probably the best thing to do, Kevin, would be for you and me to sit down and do a documentary based on putting all of these factors together. But that's basically my analysis. I 100% agree with Palmer's information, except that he didn't realize that you have a inherent gamma ray sink in the granite bedrock and in the construction of the building. So anyhow, with that, I would just like to say that I really do appreciate the work that they did. And then also, I didn't get into it on the NIST failure modes. They said, well, since World Trade Center 1 and 2 failed because of an exterior column damage, and that just caused the whole building to collapse. But World Trade Center 7 was different. It had office fires, and so the reason it collapsed is that one beam was heated to the point that it moved about 3 or 4 inches and fell off of a haunch, and a single beam falling inside of the building caused the whole building to collapse. Well, yeah. Well, I've been doing structural engineering design since college 50 years ago, and I've worked in hundreds of multi-story buildings in 20 different states. So I know how buildings are built, and I know that if you have a 110-story tall building, 1,350 feet high, 200 feet on a side, and it's built to withstand 120-mile-an-hour wind load from hurricanes, and you had 5 hurricanes during the life of those buildings, then and they didn't even break a window. It's pretty obvious that you didn't run into it with a flying tin can and start a couple of kerosene fires and have the building burned down. What I forgot to mention is that for some reason, okay, my radar detector's on. Hang on. I'm doing a remote today because of the water vapor absorbs microwaves. And so I'm in a place where I'm a long distance from a cell tower. What I forgot to mention was that after the FEMA report came out, Underwriters Lab, which has a division called National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, and they do UL testing on all kinds of wall and floor assemblies. They did a test on an actual exact replica of a World Trade Center floor joist with the actual loading on it. They put burners underneath it, continuous underneath it, operated it for 24 hours, and with better than the combustion that was available in the towers, because there's black smoke indicating they didn't have complete combustion, which also indicates they didn't reach the maximum 1,500 degree burning temperature for kerosene and atmospheric pressure. So with that, UL released a report that said after 24 hours of continuous burn, we were not able to measure any amount of deflection in a World Trade Center 1 bar joist subject to 24 hours of heat exposure. And they immediately fired the guy and buried the report. But that's additional evidence that it could not possibly have been done by fire. Yes.
Was that Kevin Ryan?
Yes, I was looking for that this morning, and I wasn't able to find his name and the date that he was fired. But yes, he released that report without authorization from UL, who would have definitely tamped it down so that they didn't have that material conflicting with the official narrative. And then I also saw the Leroy Halsey, initial 9/11 2017 analysis of the failure of Building 7, and then I watched their final analysis 2 years later, which they absolutely disproved the expanding beam falling off the haunch hypothesis using finite element analysis. But what they didn't explain is what did cause it. So,
well,
anyhow.
Joe, can I raise one question? Many of these issues are highly technical, but one area where those of us who aren't so technically inclined might question the nuclear hypothesis is that when we watch these demolitions unfolding, what we see is the top sort of explodes, so that part works. But then what we see is as the buildings are destroyed from top down, it looks like something, explosions are going off floor by floor from the top down, blasting the building outward and to some extent upward. And the question would be, if this is caused by a nuclear weapon down in the bedrock and it's channeled upward through the tube and it blasts the top of the building first, that makes sense. But then why do we get the top down pattern from there on out? Because you would think that the energy would have gone from bottom to top. Why would it then be destroying the building from top to bottom?
Okay, you have a mass of the building that's sitting as a cap on top of your nuclear wave that's coming up through the core of the building. As it's vaporizing out the walls of the elevator shafts, it's entering those floor levels with a plug above, and that's what's giving you some of those squibs. But also, there's absolute evidence that there was thermite cutting charges placed on some columns because they're cut at an absolutely 45-degree angle where that would not be a normal failure plane. You also had, and let me see if I can find that. You had, well, I don't really have it handy right this second. Oh, here it is. The exterior wall panels were built in 3-story sections called a Van der Riel truss. They have a 52-inch high, 2-inch thick plate steel spandrel section that's welded top and bottom to each of the floor joists. They had splice joints between the spandrel sections for each section as they were put up, and then they had end bolts, which is shown in this FEMA drawing, figure 2-3, and those were in the selected locations where they pre-planned the impact of something. They had gone in and used a plasma cutter and cut off all of the dozen splice bolts on each end on each floor for the spandrel connections. And then they also cut off the joist connections and they cut off the end connections. They placed shaped charges on it and they blew one of those sections out, landed next to the Greek Orthodox Church, and you can see it laying on the ground with no shear around any of the bolt holes on any of the spandrel or end connections, and deformations in the center of the panel where they had planned a shaped charge to blow it out of the building. So there were charges placed in the building, like I said, to blow out elevator plugs between the non-continuous elevator shafts so that they could have zone elevators. So you had to blow out those shafts, and then they blew out tunnel shafts. One of the tunnel explosions happened minutes before the plane impact in the lobby area because they didn't want the nuclear blast from Tower 1 to bleed over to Tower 2. So they had to blow out the tunnels to keep gamma rays from flowing sideways. The same thing is mentioned in the fourth generation nukes, that you have a problem with multiple nuclear weapons in the field. So,
okay.
So did that answer that question?
It's a good start. I'm sure there's more that could come up if we ever got like Richard Gage or somebody to come and debate this question, and maybe in the future we'll find somebody. Well, I think we've just about finished the allotted hour, and I actually have to rescue my plants by manually opening the greenhouse window. So unfortunately, I can't stay here for another hour, which actually I would like to do because this is really fascinating and highly informative. So Rick, can you judge who's won the debate, the physics Europe team or the engineering US team?
Oh, well, our practice is to give an honorarium to all participants, and with your email addresses, look for email Coinbase.com is an easy way to get started with cryptocurrency. And then I'll send you the 0.000911 Bitcoin and Ethereum, which you can convert to 911 hex. So thank you so much for this, attending this, and it's good to keep public awareness on 9/11. Of course, it is on September 11th, but today is about 6 months away from 9/11. It's good for people to have this reminder that there are many suspicious things about the official conspiracy theory.
Okay.
And Heinz, I would just like to say, if you got any feedback on the hypothesis that I put out about the gamma ray absorption, I'd be delighted to carry on a dialogue with you, and hopefully you can come with a meeting of minds about the size of the weapon and the way it actually operated. But anyhow, God bless you guys. You're doing God's work.
Thank you.
Okay, that goes for all of you. So thank you so much. God bless Francois Roby, Heinz Palmer, Joseph Olson, Rick Shattuck. I'm Kevin Barrett of truthjihad.com. And that's a wrap for our 9/11 physics debate. So thank you all. Take care. God bless.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.